Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. UFC 283 Brazil, Glover Teixeira versus Jamahal Hill is almost here. It's a little over a week away, and I'm going to go through the entire pay-per-view main card, briefly discuss each fight, and then at the end of the video, I am going to grade UFC 283 on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being the worst pay-per-view ever, 10 being the greatest pay-per-view of all time, and I'm going to answer the question whether or not you should purchase UFC 283. Now, before I get into any of that, I've put the entire UFC 283 main card down in the description. I want you to go look at it and comment down below what grade would you give UFC 283 on a scale from 1 to 10 before you even hear my opinion. Now, before I get into talking about the fights, I've already done a bunch of UFC 283 content, one being top 3 things I love about UFC 283, and the other being the top 3 things I hate about UFC 283. I will link those both down in the description if you want to go check them out after this video, and I'll be doing a bunch of UFC 283 predictions very soon, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of those. Okay, now before I talk about the fight that opens up the main card, the 3 most important factors to me when I'm looking at a fight card is relevancy to the division. Is it a #1 contender fight? Is it a fight that's going to propel them into a #1 contender fight? Is it a championship fight? That is the most important thing to me. Then you have the quality of the fighters. Are both fighters elite level fighters or close to elite level fighters? Then you also have, does the matchup make sense? And is it a fan-friendly matchup? Is it going to be, most likely, is it going to be an exciting fight? So those are the 3 most important factors to me. Starting off with the fight that opens up the main card, a light heavyweight fight between Paul Craig and Johnny Walker. And this is a fight that I am excited for. I think it's a quality matchup. I think it's going to be a fun fight no matter who wins this fight. You have Paul Craig, who's an elite level submission artist. He's constantly trying to drag people to the ground. And then you have Johnny Walker, who never really lived up to the hype. You know, at one point people were saying Johnny Walker's the guy to defeat Jon Jones. But nonetheless, this should be a compelling matchup because you basically have striker versus grappler. Now, Johnny Walker, don't get me wrong, he has submission skills. He submitted Ian Cutelaba in his last fight. But Paul Craig, I mean, he has a submission win over Jamahal Hill. I mean, technically that might have been a TKO, but he had him in a triangle and then an armbar, and then eventually got stopped. He has a win over Magomed Ankalaev, so he has some big wins within the division. He's coming off a loss right now against Volkan Ozdemir, where he didn't look particularly good. Johnny Walker's coming only in on a 1-fight win streak, so this isn't going to propel them to a title shot by any means, but I think it's a quality fight. Both guys are ranked in the top 15. And I think the matchup should be pretty exciting because it's going to be Paul Craig trying to drag him to the ground, and it's going to be Johnny Walker looking for the KO. Moving up on the card, we have a women's flyweight fight. We have Lauren Murphy versus Jessica Andrade. Now, for me, this fight isn't like the most compelling fight ever, but I mean, Jessica Andrade is usually exciting. And both girls are ranked in the top 10. I think Lauren Murphy's currently ranked number 4 in the UFC official rankings. But honestly, I really don't want Lauren Murphy on a main card of a pay-per-view. I just don't think it's right. They tried to force her versus Miesha Tate on the UFC 276 main card. Luckily, that didn't come to fruition. But it is still relevant to the division. It should be relatively exciting, especially with Jessica Andrade in there. So I really can't hate on it too much. I just wish this was on the prelims. I wish, at one point, the fight kind of fell out, but we had Brad Tavares versus Gregory Rodriguez on the prelims. I thought that should have been on the main card instead of this fight. But this fight is relevant to the division. Jessica Andrade is an elite level fighter. Lauren Murphy is at the top of the division, regardless of what you think of her skill set. Do I think either one of these girls is going to get a title shot anytime soon? I really don't. Jessica Andrade has already fought and lost to Valentina Shevchenko. Lauren Murphy's already fought and lost to Valentina Shevchenko. I mean, Jessica Andrade is coming in on a 2-fight win streak. She did defeat Amanda Lemos in her last fight, but that was at strawweight. Now she's going back up to flyweight. Lauren Murphy won her last fight against Miesha Tate, but how much does that really mean? Miesha Tate's like 54 at this point in time. So the fight, it kind of puts me off as far as being on a pay-per-view main card. I wish this card was a little bit more stacked. But nonetheless, it is an okay women's fight, and I'm always excited to see Jessica Andrade fight. It just leaves a bad taste in my mouth whenever we're looking at a UFC pay-per-view and we're having Lauren Murphy on the main card. Moving up to the featured fight on the main card, we have a welterweight matchup, Gilbert Burns versus Neil Magny. Now, this is a fight that I kind of hate for multiple reasons. One, Gilbert Burns has no business fighting Neil Magny, or Neil Magny has no business fighting Gilbert Burns, however you want to say it. Because Neil Magny, while he's coming off a win over Daniel Rodriguez, he won via Darce choke. Neil Magny is not, in my opinion, this is a mismatch. This doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. There's plenty of other better matchups. Pretty much any matchup in the top 10 is better than Neil Magny. We have the fact that we got to look at Neil Magny's hairline on a UFC pay-per-view, which I'm not looking forward to. It's just awful. It's terrible. I don't want to look at it. And then you have the fact that Gilbert Burns is coming off that loss to Khamzat Chimaev, where he looked very good. It was a very close fight. It was an amazing fight. And I would much rather see him against like anyone else. I'd rather see him in the Khamzat Chimaev rematch. I'd rather see him versus Colby Covington. I'd rather see him versus Bilal Muhammad. I'd rather see him against Jorge Masvidal. I mean, I could name a litany of opponents that I'd rather see him versus than Neil Magny. Early prediction, spoiler alert, I'm going Gilbert Burns in this fight, and I don't think it's super close. Neil Magny is a very well-rounded fighter, but he's basically always been a gatekeeper for the top 10. So I don't like this matchup. I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense. I think it's lopsided skill-wise. Neil Magny is a very well-rounded fighter, but he's not the elite of the elite. And unless Gilbert Burns has fallen off a cliff, or unless he gets clipped with a massive shot, because Gilbert Burns has been a little bit chinny in the past, I just can't imagine a world where Gilbert Burns loses his fight. And for me, I just hate it because there's so many more better matchups we could have gotten. Jorge Masvidal's too busy pretending he's a politician out in the world. He didn't want to fight Gilbert Burns, ducking Gilbert Burns. He wants a title shot, basically his third title shot after beating his last win was over Nate Diaz all the way back in 2019. I would have much preferred any other matchup. I think it's a lopsided fight. And really, I don't care for this fight at all, even though I love watching Gilbert Burns fight. So the featured fight on the main card is really a letdown. Moving on to the co-main event. And this is a fight that honestly is my most anticipated fight on UFC 283. It's in Brazil. We have Deiveson Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno for the flyweight title. We have interim champion Brandon Moreno looking to unify belts with Deiveson Figueiredo. I am super pumped for this fight. And I know there is some people who go out of their way to say, I don't want to see this for a fourth time. I could watch Figgy and Moreno fight 20 times over. They are both the elite of the elite. All three fights, they're 1-1-1. They have one, each have one win and there's one draw. And we have to see this for a fourth time. The last fight was razor close. It could have went either way. And I just think this is the fight that ends the chapter between Figgy and Moreno. We have to finally get a resolution to Figgy versus Moreno, because people are saying, the first fight, they're saying Figgy would have won had it not been there was a point deduction mid-fight. Figgy would have won, and most likely he would have, but there was a point deduction. And then they end up in a draw in the first fight. Then they get the rematch. Brandon Moreno dominates, and they say Figgy had a bad weight cut, this and that. And then in the third fight, it's razor close. It comes down to the decision, and Deiveson Figueiredo gets the decision. And people said, some people thought Brandon Moreno won. I thought Brandon Moreno won. It was not a robbery. It was razor close. But there's no doubt these are two of the best fighters in the UFC. Both guys are the elite of the elite. And I am dying to see this matchup. You have the fact that they're unifying the flyweight title. I cannot wait to see Deiveson Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno. This is one of my most anticipated fights that's currently scheduled in the UFC. And I feel like because they're smaller guys, there's not enough credit there. There's just not enough credit put there. But these are both elite level fighters. Stylistically, it doesn't get any bigger. It's for a UFC title. And then there's no way that this is a boring fight. There is absolutely no way that Figgy Moreno 4 is a boring fight. You have an amazing storyline leading into this fight. 1-1-1. The first, 4 fight for a UFC title in UFC history. I'm really looking forward to this matchup. And this is my most anticipated fight on UFC 283, and I cannot wait to see how this fourth fight plays out. Moving on to the main event, we have Glover Teixeira versus Jamahal Hill for the vacant light heavyweight title. For those of you who don't know, Jiri Prochazka was the light heavyweight champion. He was supposed to rematch against Glover Teixeira, the guy he took the belt from back in June of last year. Jiri gets injured 2 weeks out, and they decide, you know what, we're going to offer Glover Teixeira Magomed Ankalaev, who was supposed to fight in the co-main event against Jan Blachowicz, and we're going to make it for the vacant belt. Jiri's going to vacate the belt. Well, Glover Teixeira says, I need another month. You're giving me a completely different opponent. I need another month. Well, they said, you know what, we need a main event for UFC 282. So we're going to do Jan Blachowicz versus Magomed Ankalaev for that vacant belt. And a lot of people felt like Glover Teixeira got screwed over. Well, what happens in Jan Blachowicz versus Magomed Ankalaev? There is a draw. And Dana White didn't like the fight, and he was pissed afterwards, and now you don't have a champion, and when are you going to have a champion? Because the two guys you just had fight for a belt are both going to be injured for a while and be out for at least a few months at the minimum. So he decides, you know what, we need a main event for UFC 283. Glover Teixeira was already getting ready for UFC 282. Let's do Glover Teixeira versus Jamahal Hill. A little bit of a wonky matchup, but it is definitely a super exciting stylistic fight because you have Glover Teixeira, who is a super well-rounded fighter, but we know what he wants to do. He wants to take you down, beat you up, and submit you on the ground. And Glover Teixeira is getting up there in age. He wanted to reclaim his belt. Some people thought if he can beat Jiri Prochazka in the rematch, he may ride off into the sunset and retire. And now you have Jamahal Hill, a fresh face in the light heavyweight division, with absolute nuclear power in both of his hands. And Glover Teixeira has been getting rocked in the last few of his fights, even the fights he's winning. And his last fight against Jiri Prochazka back at 275 was an absolute war. So stylistically, this is an amazing fight. The only thing I don't like about it is Jamahal Hill wasn't supposed to fight till March. So he's coming in on very, very short notice. But hopefully he was in shape. It's going to be tough regardless fighting a guy like Glover Teixeira. But Glover Teixeira, nonetheless, he only gets a month to prepare for Jamahal Hill. Jamahal Hill is a different matchup than Jiri Prochazka, who's an absolute wild man. So it's a very interesting stylistic matchup. It doesn't get any bigger than a UFC light heavyweight title, basically in terms of stakes in the division. And I absolutely love this fight. I love this matchup. I love the stylistic matchup. Would I have preferred Glover Teixeira versus Jiri Prochazka? Yes, in a perfect world, that's what I would have preferred. But this is still a solid fight. And without this main event, I mean, the co-main event, Figgy versus Moreno 4, is a very, very good fight. But you really needed this main event atop of the card because the card would have been lackluster after Figgy versus Moreno. There's not a whole lot to get excited for after that. So the UFC did the right thing in adding this fight to the top of UFC 283. I'm happy that it's not for an interim light heavyweight belt. I'm happy that it's for an undisputed UFC light heavyweight belt because I'm so tired of interim belts. Jiri Prochazka, if he's going to be out for a whole year, it kind of makes sense to have him vacate the belt. And this is going to be an exciting stylistic matchup. Both guys are the elite of the elite in the division, and I cannot wait to see Glover Teixeira versus Jamahal Hill at UFC 283. And what a storyline for Glover. He could claim the light heavyweight title back, become the two-time light heavyweight champion, and win it in Brazil, and possibly retire and ride off to the sunset, which I kind of hate because then you leave a vacant light heavyweight title again. Maybe that opens the door for Paul Craig or Johnny Walker to potentially fight for a title after that, because if Glover beats Jamahal Hill and then retires, everyone's like fought for the belt in the last 4 months, basically, and Jiri Prochazka's out. So who knows what's liable to happen in the light heavyweight division. I hope that scenario doesn't happen. I hope if Glover Teixeira wins, he defends the belt against someone, at least this summer, and then hopefully fights Jiri Prochazka if he continues to hold on to the belt. But nonetheless, it's a quality fight. The top 2 title fights on this card, I am really looking forward to. But after that, it kind of falls off. And that's where I'm getting into my grade for UFC 283. I'm really looking forward to the main event. I'm really looking forward to the co-main event. Again, my most anticipated fight on the card is the flyweight title fight. But after that, we kind of have a fall off because while Gilbert Burns is like a top 5 fighter in the welterweight division, the matchup is lackluster. I don't think anyone's clamoring to see Gilbert Burns take on Neil Magny in his hairline. Jessica Andrade versus Lauren Murphy. I mean, it's okay. It's okay. I'm always excited to see Jessica Andrade fight, but I find it hard to believe that in this day and age, with the talent pool as deep as it is, we have Lauren Murphy on the main card of a UFC pay-per-view. But I get it. Jessica Andrade is Brazilian. They're putting on the main card of a Brazilian pay-per-view. And then you have Johnny Walker versus Paul Craig, which is an exciting stylistic matchup, but it doesn't mean a whole lot. So, you know, this card is okay. I would call it an okay card. It's not great. It's okay. And that's why I am going to grade UFC 283, UFC Brazil. I am going to grade it a 5 out of 10. I just think the back end of the card could have used a little bit more help. And again, I'm only grading the pay-per-view portion of this card, but I can't, you know, outside of it's a 2-fight card, basically. For me, it's a 2-fight card because outside of that main and co-main, even as a hardcore fan, it's hard for me to get pumped for Gilbert Burns versus Neil Magny. It's hard for me to get pumped for Jessica Andrade versus Lauren Murphy. It's, you know, Paul Craig versus Johnny Walker, I'm looking forward to. It should be super exciting, but not super relevant to the division outside of maybe if Glover retires, they could become relevant in the light heavyweight division because everyone has fought for the title. I don't think it's a terrible card. I am kind of a strict grader. I think I gave UFC 282. I think I gave it like a 4.5 or a 4. So I am a strict grader, but I think a 5 is fair enough. I do think, to answer the question, should you buy UFC 283? I think you should, because for me personally, the top 2 fights are worth the cost of the pay-per-view. Even just a co-main event for me, I am dying to see Figgy versus Moreno. I know some people like these crazy personalities like Conor McGregor, Chael Sonnen from back in the day, but for me, nothing gets me more excited than 2 elite level fighters fighting for the belt. And the fact that they fought each other 3 times before and they know each other so well, it makes me so pumped for that co-main event. And also, I feel like I would have maybe gave this like a 6 if the main event wasn't on short notice. I feel like that takes a little bit of luster off the main event because no matter what happens, whoever loses kind of has that excuse, well, I took it on short notice. I took this matchup on short notice. So I think it kind of just knocks down UFC 283 a little bit. But I still think those top 2 fights give this a solid 5 out of 10. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Is my grade right? Is it wrong? Is it terrible? Is it absolutely terrible? I would love to know what you think. And don't forget to comment what grade you would give UFC 283. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.